Good morning. Welcome to the Subcommittee on Environment and Oversight in the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Our hearing on examining the scientific and operational integrity of EPA's IRIS program. I'm grateful to be back. Good to see so many back, and I know others will be coming, and I hope all of you had a productive work period in your districts. The Subcommittee on Environment and Oversight will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing, entitled Examining the Scientific and Operational Integrity of EPA's IRIS program. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Welcome to our subcommittee hearing entitled Examining the Scientific and Operational Integrity of EPA's IRIS program. Today, we will hear from witnesses who are experts in the fields of epidemiology and toxicology and learn about their interactions with EPA's IRIS program. The original purpose of IRIS was simply to identify and characterize the health hazards of chemicals that are found in the environment. However, this program has long suffered from a lack of scientific transparency and an inability to produce work in a timely fashion. Even worse, IRIS appears to have been used by the previous administration as cover for unjustified and unscientific regulatory action, something well outside the scope of the program's mandate. I'm far from the only one raising the alarm. In fact, both the National Academy of Science and the Government Accountability Office have been critical of the management of the IRIS program. In February of this year, GAO again included IRIS on its annual high-risk list, which identifies federal programs that have greater than normal vulnerabilities to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. In both 2011 and 2014, NAS made numerous recommendations for IRIS that have never been fully implemented. For example, NAS found that IRIS assessment methods and reporting continue to be a concern, especially in light of the extremely long process that IRIS takes to choose chemicals and complete its evaluations. Despite the numerous deficiencies that were highlighted in both the GAO and NAS reports, IRIS fails to show any sign of improvement. It is now the role of Congress as the ultimate steward of taxpayer dollars to carefully assess whether IRIS can even be salvaged. I myself remain very skeptical and simply cannot support the program in its current form. What I find most troubling is that IRIS may be providing conflicting or duplicative information and creating confusion for Americans regarding either the harm or lack of harm that any given chemical may possess. If that is indeed the case, IRIS poses a threat to the public's trust and safety and simply cannot be allowed to continue to operate. I'm also deeply concerned by the fact that we can actually point to cases in which determinations by IRIS have been inappropriately used to make regulatory decisions. For example, the previous administration took action against a chemical manufacturer in Louisiana based on a faulty IRIS determination, even though that particular company was currently in compliance with all emissions regulations put forward under the Clean Air Act. Actions like the one initiated by IRIS in Louisiana do not inspire confidence in our federal agencies. This committee is committed to ensuring that EPA uses the best available science. IRIS, it appears, has failed to use even passable science on many occasions, and what is so troubling is that even when IRIS administrators are alerted to this fundamental problem, they take absolutely no corrective action. We must also be committed to ensuring that EPA's actions are based on the highest levels of scientific integrity. The fact that IRIS has been subjected to continued scrutiny of its scientific processes and continued requests for Information Quality Act reviews should send a clear signal that the program is failing and is in serious danger of irrevocably subverting its mission. All those concerns aside, and they are considerable, I'm hopeful that the witnesses before us today can provide Congress with information to better inform actions that this committee may take. We all want to ensure the protection of American citizens from the potentially harmful impacts of chemicals. If IRIS is the appropriate program to do that, we in Congress must ensure that it is properly organized and makes informed decisions. Moreover, we must ensure that the efforts of IRIS to evaluate chemicals are based on real-world threats, not theoretical ones. I would briefly take a moment to point out that the existence of or changes to the IRIS program would not have an impact on the continued effectiveness of EPA's risk management program. I look forward to learning from our distinguished panel today and have no doubt that this will be a wide-ranging and fascinating discussion. I thank each of our witnesses for being here today. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time And recognize now the ranking member of the Environment Subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Oregon, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this committee has a long tradition of examining the Environmental Protection Agency's Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS. The last time this committee held a hearing on it was back in 2014, and at that hearing, I said that this committee needs to allow the EPA to fulfill its mission of protecting the public's health from environmental hazards. Producing assessments of chemicals that may cause harm to our constituents and our communities is critical to that mission. I am disappointed that today this committee is once again headed in the wrong direction. Rather than undermining important public health assessments, we should be supporting and, in fact, strengthening the EPA's efforts to protect Americans from unsafe chemical exposure. Given that the committee has not held a hearing on this issue in 3 years, it's troubling that today the majority is calling two witnesses with clear interest in a particular outcome, but did not call the EPA or the GAO. This does not seem to me like a hearing to investigate how we can best protect our constituents' health, which is what we should be doing, but instead an attempt to look for a basis for weakening or eliminating the IRIS program. That is unacceptable. It's also perplexing that the majority is hosting a hearing to emphasize industry-held criticisms of the IRIS program at a time when independent organizations that have investigated the IRIS program are citing its notable improvements. And, Mr. Chairman, you said that IRIS has failed to show any signs of improvement, but just last week, the independent EPA Science Advisory Board, or the SAB, wrote a letter to Administrator Pruitt praising the progress of the IRIS program. That letter said, quote, "The SAB has observed significant enhancements in the IRIS program over the last few years, with impactful changes over the past year and marked progress over the past 6 months. The changes are so extensive and positive that they constitute a virtual reinvention of IRIS." And I'll repeat that last line. The changes are so extensive and positive that they constitute a virtual reinvention of IRIS. The work of IRIS is especially critical to protecting the health of our nation's children. The human health assessments developed through the program provide vital information that aids the EPA in its decision-making and also informs state and local governments and public health professionals. Fundamentally, the IRIS program helps those tasked with protecting the public's health to make the best decisions they can by using the best available science to determine the potential harmful effects of chemical exposures. That is precisely why this committee has taken an interest in the activities of IRIS in the past, particularly when the program was not living up to its potential. In response to a request from Congress, the National Academies reviewed the IRIS program and released a report 2 months prior to our 2014 hearing, which made recommendations for improvements that EPA should implement. What is the status of those recommendations? What progress has the program made, and what improvements are still needed? Those are the questions we should be asking the EPA and the National Academies. Unfortunately, the majority did not invite anyone from the EPA or the National Academies to offer any answers. Mr. Chairman, the IRIS program is too important for there not to be a thoughtful examination of its status and a fuller review of the recent progress it has made. This committee has the important role of providing oversight of the administration's efforts in its jurisdiction. During the Obama administration, this committee held dozens and dozens of hearings investigating actions of the administration, and the EPA, including the EPA administrator, was here to answer. Yet now that there's a Republican administration, this committee has failed to have a single hearing with any of the presidential appointments in its jurisdiction. During the Obama administration, Administrator Pruitt testified in front of this committee in his role as Oklahoma's Attorney General and was highly critical of the EPA. Now that he's the EPA administrator, the American people deserve the opportunity to hear his priorities for the EPA. This committee must fulfill its duty of providing oversight of the agencies in its jurisdiction. Mr. Chairman, will you commit to holding a full committee hearing on a legislative day this year with EPA Administrator Pruitt?
Is the gentlewoman done?
No, I'm asking, Mr. Chairman, will you commit to holding a full committee hearing on a legislative day this year with EPA Administrator Pruitt? He has not been before this committee yet.
Well, I appreciate you asking me a question in public that you've never broached with me in private, which I consider to be highly improper and highly unusual, frankly. And I'm happy to discuss with you in private.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I ask that the letter from the EPA's Science Advisory Board, which I referenced earlier, be made a part of the record. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Thank you. And now we're going to recognize Chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Mr. LaHood, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs, and good morning and welcome to today's joint subcommittee hearing on, quote, examining EPA's Integrated Risk Information System Program, unquote. Today we will hear from expert witnesses highlighting various examples of why oversight of the IRIS program is critical to restoring scientific integrity to the agency. I would like to thank the witnesses in advance for their testimony today. EPA created IRIS in 1985 under no statutory authority, defining no safeguards, timelines, or binding requirements with which the program must adhere. EPA intended for the program to, quote, foster consistency in the evaluation of chemical toxicity across the agency, unquote. However, since 2011, multiple reports have been issued raising glaring deficiencies in the program that to this day have gone unaddressed. As we will hear today from witnesses, there are many questions and issues that have been raised about IRS assessments being based on sound science. There are multiple instances of the IRIS program relying on outdated or flawed studies to complete assessments, neglecting to obtain or use the scientifically critical raw supporting data related to risk assessments. Moreover, IRIS has failed to adapt mode of action science utilized by other offices within EPA, which we will hear today from Dr. Buss. More troubling, it appears the quasi-regulatory decisions have been based off the assessments completed by the IRIS program. The fact that many of these assessments may be faulty illustrates why oversight is so important to the function of our government. An accredited scientific body, the National Academy of Sciences, has raised serious questions and concerns about IRIS. The GAO has included IRIS on its biannual high-risk list since 2009. And this committee sent EPA a letter last year raising similar concerns. These combined efforts have resulted in little, if any, improvement to the IRIS program. By holding this hearing today and diving deeper into the issue at hand, I hope to continue an oversight of the IRIS program to bring attention to the scientific integrity issues that need to be addressed here today. And Mr. Chairman, I would also add, I know a number of issues have been raised already here this morning. I would just mention that the minority mentioned the EPA Science Advisory Board letter to Administrator Pruitt as evidence the IRIS program has been improved significantly. This letter was sent to Administrator Pruitt last Friday, September 1st, less than 36 hours after the Science Advisory Board meeting and 2 days after the public notice of today's hearing. The board was not tasked with providing official review or comment on the presentation highlighting changes to the IRIS program. It appears that the SBA recognizes that issues have existed in the past with regard to the IRIS program and that issues still persist currently. Given the speed with which this letter was sent, I find it difficult for the letter to carry much weight toward establishing any significant progress with the IRIS program. Moreover, this letter fails to provide for any meaningful scientific scrutiny of reviews completed in the past where scientific integrity issues have been raised, which is one of the major issues with the program and why we are here today, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. LaHood. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Mr. Byer, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs, and thank you, Chairman Biggs, Chairman LaHood, for this hearing. And I, too, must convey my disappointment with this hearing and the apparent purpose. I'm encouraged by my friend Chairman LaHood's comments that he believes it's the appropriate role for this committee to have oversight of IRIS. But this, I fear this isn't a hearing about oversight, that this is going to be a hearing about how to, not a hearing about how to improve the critical function of the EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, and not a hearing to actually determine the facts about the remarkable progress they've recently made. This appears to be a hearing for industry. In the letter that the EPA Science Advisory Board wrote to Administrator Pruitt last week touted all the progress made by the IRIS program and its importance in protecting the public health. To quote, the SCB members in attendance voted unanimously that it communicate to you their enthusiasm for the IRS's program's progress. However, the majority has not invited anybody from the SAB or the National Academy of Sciences or the GAO or the EPA to testify about the significant improvements the program has made. I don't think that it undercuts the validity or the importance of the SAB's letter to suggest that it was at least partially a reaction to the announcement of this hearing, that of course it was. When they saw this was coming up, they thought it was important to note all the progress that had been made. The majority has instead chosen to ignore this progress and invite two industry scientists as witnesses who will undoubtedly criticize the IRIS program and the EPA in general. And despite assurances from the majority staff that this hearing is simply about hearing from stakeholders, the real intent seems to coincide with a call by industry to eliminate IRS altogether. For example, if I could ask one slide to be put up. I would note that our Chairman Biggs recently offered an amendment to HA 3354, the Appropriations Act of 2018, that would zero out all funding for EPA's IRIS program, effectively abolishing it. I believe this hearing should be viewed in the larger context of what it actually is, which is another attack on the American public's environmental health, another opportunity for industry consultants and industry-paid scientists to attempt to weaken the effectiveness of the EPA, the only federal agency charged with protecting the environment and the health of the American people. You know, whatever efforts this administration takes to impede progress made to the EPA's IRS program, or to reduce its role in identifying harmful chemicals, or eliminate this program altogether, those efforts unfortunately fit neatly into the anti-science agenda already unveiled by this administration. Since the Trump administration came into office less than 8 months ago, political appointees at the EPA are now reviewing grants to conduct scientific studies rather than actual scientists, as has been the tradition through Democratic and Republican presidents in the past. The EPA has withdrawn a request to industry regarding methane emissions from oil and gas industry, which is a growing and dangerous problem. Administrator Scott Pruitt has made it known he wants more industry representatives on the agency's scientific advisory boards, an effort that could potentially undermine the health and safety of the American public. Key positions at the EPA are now being filled with individuals with deep ties to industry rather than qualified scientists or qualified public health experts. Senior federal officials and scientists have resigned in protest over the direction of the Trump administration and the actions of the EPA administrator. And the EPA and other federal agencies have scrubbed references to climate change from their websites, and some federal offices have reportedly banned the use of the term. So it really disheartens me that the Science Committee is not investigating important scientific issues that have a real impact on the health and safety of our citizens across the country, their exposure to chemical pollutants, and the human health implications of a warming climate. Rather, the committee seems resolved to providing a forum for industry scientists to advocate for policies and procedures that will please the industries they work for but cause harm to the environment and the public health of all Americans across the political spectrum. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I too must say that I'm disappointed, but I'm really not surprised that we're holding this hearing today. Sadly, I've had to make this statement too many times in the last 4 years. How can we, in good conscience, title this hearing as an examination of the scientific and operational integrity of EPA's IRIS program when there's no one here from EPA to testify? I don't think we can. How do we conduct the necessary oversight for this program when the Government Accountability Office is not present to answer questions about their recent review of ICES? I don't know that we can. How are we serving the best interests of our constituents and of all Americans when the National Academies of Sciences is not present to discuss their report upon which the last 3 years' worth of reforms to IRIS were based upon? I don't think we are. How can we have an honest discussion about this program while ignoring the key entities that have reviewed it and studied in recent improvements? I don't think we can. I would also note that just last week, the EPA's Independent Science Advisory Board, the SAB, sent a letter to EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt praising the progress that IRIS program has made. The letter said in part, and I quote, "The board recommends the agency for making such significant improvements over a short period of time. We are optimistic that the restructured IRIS program will strengthen the scientific foundations of risk assessment and protect the health and safety of the American public," unquote. But we are not here to hear that today. Instead, the majority has invited two industry scientists to voice their criticisms of IRIS. Let me be clear. Industry perspectives should not be excluded from scientific discussions on environmental issues at EPA. And they are not now, and nor have they ever been. The current membership of EPA's Science Advisory Board, for instance, includes representatives from the Dow Chemical Company, Procter & Gamble, and ExxonMobil. However, I'm concerned that industry, the leadership of this committee, and now this administration are seeking to let industry drive the science upon which critical decisions about protecting the public's health and environment are made. The current criticisms of the EPA's IRIS program and by industry highlights this point. We've seen this tactic used by industry before, and I'm sure that we'll see it repeated in the future. Mr. Chairman, not only can we do better, we must do better. The American people deserves a Congress that is working for them and with them, not against them, and certainly not for the interest of wealthy, polluting industries. I hope that one day soon, our committee will be a forum for a balanced discussion on the critical issues under our jurisdiction. Unfortunately, today's hearings fall well short of that mark. My last point, the response from the majority to my statement may be that minority members are permitted to invite one witness to these hearings, and that we could have invited anyone we wanted to, such as a representative of the EPA, the SAB, or the GAO of the national academies. My response to that, Mr. Chairman, is that I don't believe it is the job of the minority to do the majority's job for them. It is clear that all of those entities should be represented at today's hearing, not just the single witness allocated for the minority. If we are serious about conducting credible oversight of IRIS, I would hope that the majority will commit to a follow-up hearing so that those voices may be heard. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the gentlewoman. I want to now introduce our witnesses, the three with impeccable scientific backgrounds and expertise. And I'm grateful that each of you would take time to be here today. When you give your testimony, at some point you'll get 5 minutes, and I'll stand up and dance as you get close, so you'll know that you're near the end. Dr. Kenneth Mundt is our first witness. He is the principal at Ramboll, Environ, where he serves as the Health Sciences Global Practice Area Leader and Director of Applied Epidemiology. Additionally, Dr. Mundt is an adjunct faculty member at the University of North Carolina and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He received a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and a PhD in epidemiology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Our next witness today is Dr. James Buss, Senior Managing Scientist at Exponent. Dr. Buss has over 23 years' experience as a consulting toxicologist in the Toxicology and Environmental Research and Consulting Unit of the Dow Chemical Company, and serves as an adjunct professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology at Michigan State University. He received a bachelor's degree in medicinal chemistry and a PhD in pharmacology from Michigan State University. And our final witness today is Dr. Thomas Burke, professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Burke also serves as the director of the Johns Hopkins Risk Sciences and Public Policy Institute. He received a Master's of Public Health from the University of Texas and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And I now recognize Dr. Mundt for 5 minutes to present his testimony. Dr. Mundt.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, you're going to need to press the talk button. There you go. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Kenneth Mundt. I'm an epidemiologist and health sciences practice network leader at Ramboll Environ. My career is focused on evaluating health risks of chemicals, particularly in the workplace. Thank you and the committees for the opportunity today to provide the highlights of a scientific evaluation of the 2010 IRIS toxicological review of chloroprene that colleagues at Ramboll Environ and I recently completed. Our evaluation of the IRIS review illustrates how important good science is to understanding human health risks and highlights some issues that need to be addressed. IRIS is responsible for evaluating the potential human health effects of chemical exposures. However, as noted, the IRIS review process has been criticized by expert panels of the National Research Council, the National Academy of Sciences. In particular, the NAS emphasized the importance of transparency and rigor in the IRIS review methods. Our evaluation of the IRIS review of chloroprene identified several scientific problems impacting the evaluation of chloroprene as a human carcinogen and leading to the derivation of an inhalation unit risk, or IUR, that is 156 times greater than the IUR re-derived. The following were among the key scientific problems we found with that IRIS review. First, EPA failed to critically evaluate the quality of each epidemiological study of chloroprene exposed workers, which resulted in giving equal weight to all studies, both good and bad. Suggestive positive associations were reported among the weakest studies with the greatest limitations. However, the largest and best study demonstrated no increased risk of liver or lung cancers. The NAS reviews provided guidance on study selection, methods for evaluating study quality, accounting for various forms of bias that impact study findings, and integrating evidence so that stronger studies are given greater weight. Second, EPA ignored the strongest study's conclusion, quote, persons exposed to chloroprene or vinyl chloride at the levels encountered in the 4 study sites did not have elevated risks of mortality from any of the causes of death, including all cancers combined, and lung and liver cancers, the cancer sites of a priori interest, end quote. In contrast, IRIS review noted, quote, relative risk estimates for liver cancer, while not statistically significant, increased with increasing exposure, indicating a dose-response trend, end quote. However, this trend also was not statistically significant and provides no evidence of increased risk. Third, and most importantly, EPA did not fully account for large and well-recognized differences between mice and humans. Mice appear to be far more sensitive to chloroprene than other animals, or even humans, which can be explained by differences in pharmacokinetics. Accounting for these differences, using standard methods applied by EPA in IRIS reviews of other chemicals dramatically reduced the estimated IUR. Ultimately, applying standard EPA methodology and conservative assumptions, we derived a revised IUR. Compared with ours, the EPA IUR was 156 times higher. Simply put, the EPA's IUR is extremely large, scientifically implausible, and has significant real-world consequences. Correction of the IUR is especially critical, given that it has prompted lawsuits and enforcement actions. Our critical review and integration of the published epidemiological and toxicological evidence on chloroprene also highlights the need to reconsider EPA's classification of chloroprene. The IRIS review classified chloroprene as, quote, likely to be carcinogenic to humans, end quote, based on 5 stated criteria. We determined that 3 of these criteria are not supported by a weight of evidence in analysis, and a 4th, the structural similarities to other chemicals, was not informative. It also underscores the importance of some of the improvements recommended by the NAS. As the committee looks at how EPA can be expending resources more efficiently and how to improve the IRIS program as a whole, the chloroprene example may help identify specific areas where scientific and procedural flaws may be targeted and remedied. There's nothing that precludes the EPA from using credible outside scientific resources to foster constructive scientific debate and enhance their evaluation and decision-making capabilities. In doing so, EPA will better achieve justifiable scientific conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mundt. And now I recognize Dr. Buss for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Good morning. I am Dr. James Buss, and I am a toxicologist with the consulting firm Exponent. I will preface my comments by noting that the increasingly financially and other resource-constrained realities confronting our nation demands nothing less than a cost-effective, transparent, and science-based evaluation and regulation of environmental chemicals. I will briefly highlight 3 major areas of concern with the IRIS program. First, IRIS has not effectively implemented the National Academy of Sciences recommendation that good risk assessment must start with good problem formulation. Second, IRIS use of chemical mode of action information to better inform its risk assessments is substantially flawed. And third, IRIS frequently does not effectively differentiate between the highest quality science and that of substantially lower quality in its evaluations. The National Academy has emphasized the importance of the question, what problems are we trying to solve, as an absolute necessity for focusing the priorities of the IRIS program. Although IRIS has recently implemented problem formulation dialogue with the public, the IRIS program has not effectively integrated this key concept into its overall prioritization processes. For example, human exposures to many, if not most chemicals, have been substantially reduced or constrained over the last several decades as a direct result of regulatory and/or industry product stewardship interventions. Yet IRIS often overlooks this important progress as a screening mechanism to rule out the need for detailed evaluations. As is commonly said in the practice of toxicology, it is the dose that makes the poison. Thus, more realistic consideration of the relationships of human exposures to doses producing toxicity at much higher doses used in experimental toxicity studies must become a key consideration to answering the practical question of, do real-world exposures indicate a reasonable need for a detailed risk assessment evaluation? Turning to the second point of concern and speaking as a toxicologist, extensive taxpayer investments into the toxicological sciences have yielded substantial advances in understanding how chemicals cause toxic effects in animals and in humans. Such mode of action information is essential to establishing the human health relevance of toxicity observed in cell or animal-based toxicity findings. In recognition of the value of mode of action science, the toxicology, risk assessment, and regulatory scientific communities have developed detailed frameworks for credible and transparent translation of these data into chemical risk assessments. While mode of action framework processes have long been included within EPA guidance procedures and are routinely and effectively used by the EPA's Office of Pesticides, the IRIS program has yet to embrace their full practice. Thus, IRIS assessments consistently default to risk decisions that do not reflect the substantial added value of mode of action science that has long been supported by taxpayer investments. Finally, the IRIS program has not implemented consistent criteria, as have other EPA offices, for appropriately weighting study quality as key to meaningful data integration. Too often, poorly conducted and/or described studies carry equal weight to those of far higher quality in the final risk decision. For example, the recent IRIS evaluation of trichloroethylene, a commercially important solvent, relied on published studies from a single university-based laboratory that were subsequently subject to 3 published error corrections that still have not clarified their experimental findings. In addition, not only were the original data from these problematic studies not available for review by the EPA, the study findings also were not reproduced in 2 much higher quality studies. In the case of trichloroethylene, the EPA decision to rely on the lower quality study to drive the risk assessment has created additional environmental remediation costs, potentially in the hundreds of millions to even billions of dollars. Thank you for the opportunity to share my personal perspectives on some of the more serious concerns that continue to plague the IRIS program. Although the IRIS program has recently introduced new evaluation tools aimed at improving the quality of its evaluation, the IRIS program, given its past reluctance to embrace substantive change, will be challenged to efficiently and effectively evolve into a program that meets the expectations of delivering timely, credible, and science-based assessments of environmental chemicals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Buss. And now I recognize Dr. Burke for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittees today. I'm Tom Burke, professor at Johns Hopkins, and my views are my own. They don't reflect the university. First, as a former Houstonian and graduate of the University of Texas School of Public Health in Houston, my thoughts are with all those impacted by Hurricane Harvey. This hearing is particularly timely as Texans work to recover, restore drinking water and housing, and evaluate the risks from contaminated floodwaters. Before joining Johns Hopkins, I worked on the front lines as an environmental and health official for the state of New Jersey, serving 3 governors. I've also served on the National Academy of Sciences Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology, the EPA Science Advisory Board, and the Board of Scientific Counselors. From 2015 to 2017, I served as the EPA Science Advisor and Deputy Assistant Administrator for Research and Development. Now, the capacity to evaluate the hazards of toxic chemicals is essential to protecting our public health. It's essential for agencies, public officials, and businesses alike to assure clean air, safe water, to respond to emergencies, and to protect our workers and communities. The EPA IRIS program is a cornerstone of our national public health capacity. IRIS is charged with the daunting task of synthesizing enormous amounts of scientific information to identify the potential for a chemical to cause adverse health effects. The program provides a consistent and comprehensive source of toxicity data, not just for agency programs, but for the regions and state officials, business and industry, and the public. IRIS is not a regulatory program, but the assessments provide essential scientific guidance for agency decisions. Not surprisingly, they're controversial. Don't like the regulation? Attack the science. There's an important distinction between the IRIS assessment process and the ultimate risk management decision. The assessments provide insights on the magnitude of risks, but they do not tell us what level of risk is acceptable, nor do they tell us how to manage risk. Ultimately, the regulatory options are the responsibility of the program offices and the administrator. Now, there are challenges to IRIS. The demand for information about the safety of chemicals is constantly growing. One of our greatest environmental challenges is the lack of basic information about health effects. The 2016 bipartisan Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act represents a great step forward, but the key to the success will be the scientific capacity of EPA. Unfortunately, there are inherent scientific uncertainties in toxicology and epidemiology, as we've heard. They present difficult challenges to IRIS. For example, does cancer in a laboratory test animal mean that chemical will cause cancer in humans? If epidemiology studies give conflicting results, which one do we choose? Rigorous stakeholder and peer review is built into the IRIS process, and it's essential for producing credible results and addressing uncertainties. Now, over the past few years, there's been great progress in improving IRIS. As was mentioned, the 2011 formaldehyde report presented a roadmap to improve the process by increasing transparency and the review of evidence. The 2014 follow-up report from the National Academies noted the progress. As has been already stated, the GAO and the EPA Science Advisory Board have also made note of the enormous forward progress that the program has taken. Now, in conclusion, EPA is a science-based agency. Ultimately, the success and credibility of EPA decisions depends upon the quality and integrity of the science behind them. The core mission of EPA is to protect public health. IRIS has a unique and essential role in supporting that mission. Now, I'd like to close on a personal note. I'd like to acknowledge the great people of IRIS and EPA Office of Research and Development. They're dedicated public servants and world-class scientists. They take on the toughest environmental challenges we face, from the dust of the World Trade Center and faucets of Flint to the toxic waters of Katrina and Harvey. They have worked selflessly to protect our nation's environment and public health. Our health depends on them. Our health depends on the IRIS program. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. Appreciate that. Appreciate the testimony of all of you. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to ask questions. And I'll start with Dr. Mundt. Dr. Mundt, in your testimony, you talked about the National Air Toxics Assessment and the findings and impacts that those findings had. And I'm wondering, you mentioned specifically the NADA findings precipitated adverse public opinion, enforcement actions, and a class action lawsuit, all of which potentially have serious economic implications for DPE and the community. Can you tell us what impact that had with, and how it relates to IRIS?
Certainly. The NADA enforcement action requires an exposure standard which is unattainable, largely because it used in its calculations the inhalation unit risk that we believe is at least 100-fold inflated from what the best scientific methods and processes would suggest. So I think the root of that particular problem arises with the erroneous derivation or the poor derivation of the IUR, and then using it in a calculation to determine at what levels humans can safely be exposed.
And I'll continue with Dr. Mundt. And the Science Committee has been committed to ensuring that the science of EPA is open and available to the American people. And that's why we passed the HONEST Act, which would require science that EPA uses to make decisions to be publicly available. In your experience, does the IRIS program live up to that transparency in science?
My experience with IRIS has been primarily with the chemicals chloroprene and formaldehyde. The reviews of both of those, at least the draft review for formaldehyde, were from 2010. And of course, the NAS reacted also to the formaldehyde IRIS draft report, identifying many of its problems. So I would say that, yes, at least in 2010, there were significant problems that have led to more serious misinterpretations of the science and probably hardships for those who are impacted by those regulatory decisions. I hear a lot about progress being made and good intentions, and I look forward to seeing new IRIS assessments that have embraced all of those recommendations and improved quality improvements. But to date, I'm really focusing on what I have seen and what has been relied upon from some of the earlier IRIS assessments.
And Dr. Buss, in your testimony, you indicated that IRIS frequently does not effectively differentiate between highest quality science and that of substantially lower quality in its evaluations. Can you tell us how that might impact regulatory environment of EPA and how we distinguish between the highest quality science and the lowest quality?
Certainly, and thank you for the question. With respect to quality assessments, there are a number of mechanisms and tools that have been used across the agency, not necessarily specific to IRIS, but to other programs of the agency that are available for rating the quality of the science. Also, the EPA has made extensive investment in terms of development of what they call good laboratory practices and setting up of guidelines for how chemicals should be tested. Those studies are generally regarded as having the highest quality. But yet often, when those studies are considered in the overall context of IRIS evaluation, you find, as in the case of trichloroethylene, the default was to a study conducted by a single laboratory that turned out not to be reproduced under two conditions of studies conducted by good laboratory practices and using EPA guidelines for conduct of those studies. The implications of that obviously is incredibly important because depending on what science you use will make a big difference in terms of the outcome of the ultimate risk values that will be derived by the IRIS program. And that, of course, then ultimately drives the final risk assessment, which I mentioned in the case of trichloroethylene can translate to a very large economic impact. So in the case of trichloroethylene, there are many Superfund sites that had been remediated under the previous trichloroethylene remediation programs that had been regarded as now an acceptable point of remediation. With this new assessment conducted by trichloroethylene by the IRIS program, many of those sites now are facing reopening, each one of them costing in the range of several $100,000 to remediate to the new level identified by IRIS. And you spread that over the range of about 1,000 additional sites that have been known to have trichloroethylene associated with them, you can see the dollars add up very rapidly. But most importantly, that really brings home the message of why it's important that the agency have the proper expertise and means and review to use the highest quality science, because the implications are important. Thank you.
Thank you. And now my time has expired, and so I'll recognize the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Dr. Burke, I'm concerned about this committee's lack of diligent oversight of the agencies in its jurisdiction since President Trump took office in January. In your opinion, how could this committee best provide constructive oversight of the IRIS program with the goal of protecting public health of the American people? For example, are there informative witnesses we would benefit from hearing from as we try to learn more about the IRIS program?
Thank you very much for the question, and yes, there are. IRIS has a daunting task, as I mentioned, and there are many members of the scientific community, including the National Academy of Sciences, the Board on Environmental Studies, as I mentioned, that have been key to making sure IRIS documents may be the most scrutinized and peer-reviewed scientific documents the agency has ever produced. There is a tremendous review process, and there is a tremendous commitment to progress. We've seen a lot of change. It's been mentioned here. And I think you need to get the right kinds of folks who have been involved in that change before you to really understand not just how important IRIS is, but all the changes that have been made to solidify it, to listen to the comments of people like my colleagues here, and to make sure the science is improved in a constant way.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. And continuing, the mission of the EPA is to protect human health and the environment, and we know that. And you've served as a science advisor for EPA, and you've been an environmental public health professional your entire career. So I'd like to hear your opinion about the general direction now in this administration with EPA Administrator Pruitt. You know, recently we've heard actions. We've heard about actions at the EPA that are raising serious concerns, including barring EPA scientists from attending scientific conferences, censoring use of the word climate change, politicizing the allocation of scientific grants, rejecting the conclusion of EPA scientists and banning some harmful chemicals. So, Dr. Burke, many anti-science actions seem to be driving decisions at the EPA. So will you please discuss the public health implications of that for individuals across the country in light of these actions?
Thank you for that question. It was a really comprehensive one, but I can address the public health issues and a concern of the public health community. Obviously, there's many great debates about the application of science. We hear this today in IRIS, but across the board. And I think it's important that we follow the evidence. But what I'm concerned about in this quest for regulatory relief is that public health has been the collateral damage here, that we really have taken our eye off the ball on the primary mission of EPA. It's a public health agency, and the science is there to provide the foundations of that public health agency.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that. I've been on this committee my entire time in Congress, and we've had many conversations about public health, and I share your concerns about losing focus on that important part of the EPA's mission. And I wonder if you could, since the time you started at the EPA in 2015 and left earlier this year, how did the IRIS program change during your time at the agency during that period of time?
Thank you for that question, too. As my colleagues know, I've been involved in the National Academy overview of an oversight of the IRIS process. And I am aware that there have been historical problems in the presentation of evidence and the management. And I worked like crazy to make sure we have the best people, that we listen to the Academy, that we begin to address the issue of problem formulation, which actually was part of a report that I chaired at the Academy to improve the IRIS process. And so I worked to get the best people there, to make sure we have the best scientific applications of systematic review, to address many of the concerns that you heard today. And the program is on a wonderful, positive trajectory.
Thank you. I appreciate your work. Mr. Chairman, this hearing really seems incomplete without the participation of the EPA to answer questions about the IRIS program and how the administration will prioritize the protection of health of the American people. There are many important environmental policies and public health issues that the committee should be addressing: the effects of sea level rise, ocean acidification, air quality. We're experiencing that in my home state of Oregon right now with terrible wildfires, air quality, coastal resiliency efforts, the broad public health impacts of climate change. But this year, the committee has not hosted a single EPA official to testify about these important matters. It's unacceptable for this committee to cede its jurisdiction and responsibilities to provide oversight of the federal agencies that are funded by our constituents. We should not go through an entire year without having an EPA official testify before this committee. So I look forward to working with the chairman and Chairman Smith. I hope we can get an administration official to appear before this committee as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony here today. Dr. Mundt, one of the intended steps in the IRA process is independent expert peer review. I wanted to ask you, do you find that this peer review process adequately facilitates discussion from all relevant stakeholders, and particularly as you look at how IRIS utilizes or does not utilize independent third party?
Thank you. I think peer review in general is subject to the quality of the individuals selected and the amount of energy and efforts that they put into that peer review. This is true for published literature as well. Journal articles are subjected to peer review, but the quality of that varies from individual to individual. I assume that the same is true with the IRIS program, that peer review panels have varied in terms of their quality, and maybe more specifically in terms of their expertise. I found with formaldehyde and with chloroprene there to be inadequate peer review support on the epidemiological literature and its interpretation. So I think that can be remedied. I think, though, that it will require more systematic assignment of peer reviewers and perhaps even provide some standard expectations or guidance that those peer reviewers deliver upon so that obvious errors or bigger problems or questions of greater concern that deserve scientific debate can be identified earlier in the process and not only after the final drafts have been made public.
Thank you. And Dr. Buss, do you want to comment on that also?
Thank you, and I would agree, certainly, that peer review is a very important aspect of the overall program. And one of the real challenges, because peer review is often conducted by individuals from the scientific community who are essentially serving as a labor of love in terms of it's not their full-time job, it requires that they have adequate time, by way of example, to prepare for these types of reviews. So I can describe a review if you want an illustration of has the agency, the IRIS program, really learned its lessons in terms of valuing that input. Two reviews which were just conducted 3 weeks ago. The actual materials of the entire 2 reports for them to review were presented to them just 4 weeks before they were scheduled to deliver their final opinion. In my mind, that's woefully inadequate. Secondly, another example in terms of does the IRIS program, have they really understood that it's important to value the input of outside comment to their overall assessment? The year before those same reviews were conducted, they actually correctly held a public session to solicit public input. At that time, their own invited expert from the National Academy of Sciences indicated that the key endpoint that they were going to use for those evaluations definitely needed the consultation of an expert pathologist. 1 year later, this program was reviewed just 3 weeks ago by the EPA Science Advisory Board, and it received severe criticism. This is a matter of public record because the agency, the IRIS program, had failed to follow up on that advice from their own National Academy consultant expert invited a year before. So that's an example of where, although the IRIS may be talking, going down the correct road, they still have a lot of need to actually put that into action. And it's not evident, at least to date, even as of events occurring just in the last several weeks, that the IRIS program truly has reflected the advances that they are promoting and as claimed as successes, for instance, by way of to their presentation to the EPA Science Advisory Board.
Thank you, Dr. Buss. Dr. Mundt, I mentioned in my opening statement that IRIS is currently operating without specific statutory authority that would hold the program accountable. Do you believe IRIS would benefit from statutory guidance from Congress? And as a follow-up on that, what else can Congress do to help ensure toxicology risk assessment is reliable and transparent, particularly with the backdrop of the National Academy of Sciences study and also the GAO study?
Thank you. I think it's a challenging question, and the solution is not immediately apparent. However, scientists in general are striving for more or less one thing, that is understanding the science and incorporating the best science. And so I think if statutory support for deriving the best science could work, then yes, of course it would. But what this usually means is adequate time, as Dr. Buss mentioned, for proper review, the right scientists who are knowledgeable about the key topics, and also support for engagement. That is, all of the scientific interests and communities. I'm frequently referred to as an industry scientist, but I'm really not. I'm an independent scientist looking at the science, and often my understanding of the science is as great as anyone's, having looked deeply into it, yet that is often not welcomed in the circles where these issues have been debated at EPA and specifically at IRIS.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you all for the testimony. It's very interesting. Dr. Burke, Dr. Buss identified 3 problems with IRIS, and the first was that they don't use, they're not good with problem formulation. And he had a perfect sentence. Do real-world exposures indicate a reasonable need for a detailed risk assessment evaluation? Do you agree with his assessment? Is there some reason why IRIS isn't or shouldn't be using that?
Well, first of all, IRIS has moved in the direction of starting with the right questions. And I think Dr. Buss rightly points out that there's a need to ask the right questions, and now that is built into the process. We don't want to have a number pulled out of the air of some bright line of what an acceptable risk is without providing a context. But let's go back to that example of TCE. TCE is probably one of the most pervasive environmental contaminants this world has ever seen. From the drinking waters of Camp Lejeune to the Superfund sites all around the country. I personally have closed water supplies in New Jersey because TCE is such a pervasive environmental contaminant, exposing millions of people. These are exactly the kinds of things that should drive our priority setting process, drive our science, and drive our problem formulation.
So it sounds like TCE would meet Dr. Buss's test of real-world exposure demonstrating reasonable need.
Absolutely.
His second concern was that the IRIS program has yet to embrace the practice of mode of action information. Why have they been reluctant to do that? Do you agree that mode of action information is important?
Mode of action information is important, and understanding those mechanisms is part of a major investment the agency has made in our computational toxicology and in advancing the science. But it's also important that we move ahead when we have evidence of a relationship to a health impact, even though the mysteries of mode of action may not be there. And this is not just specific chemicals where we lack this information, but we know in the complexities of multiple exposures in the environment, in the way that the biology of the human body works, that this is a very challenging undertaking. And the challenge is when you're charged with protecting public health, when do you have enough information to move ahead, to reduce exposure, and to support the regulatory decisions of the agency? So he raises some very important points that have been raised by the National Academy of Sciences, but therein lies the inherent uncertainty of the science base for decision-making, and we have to constantly try to improve that. And I think with mode of action, we are doing that.
Great, thank you. Dr. Mundt, it's nice to see a Dartmouth English major turns out okay. You had mentioned that there are large pharmacokinetic differences between mice and human beings. Is this an argument that we shouldn't be doing mice experiments, animal experiments? It seems to me that most of my adult life we've been measuring cancer stuff with smaller animals.
Thank you. The answer is no, not at all. We should continue to use these very good experiments appropriately. But we have to, and as the previous two speakers have noted, there's been great advances in understanding the way that chemicals cause disease. It turns out that the way that chloroprene, for example, causes tumors in mice is very different from rats and hamsters and humans. And that now can be taken into the computational toxicological developments now in hand. In fact, in 2010, EPA had access to those methods and chose not to use them. And that was one of the basic points of my written testimony. So yes, I think there's a full agreement here, and none of it suggests that we discontinue animal testing. We should probably reduce animal testing to that which is most necessary. But it does inform human health risks and can be used, if properly extrapolated to humans, for risk control and exposure control.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Burke, a very quick political question. Who was president in 1985 when IRIS was started? Okay, we go on. That's obvious. Dr. Buss, your third point was that who determined that you need to use the highest quality science, and Dr. Mundt's thing had the Wachowski chart. Who determines the highest quality science?
Well, ultimately, obviously the IRIS program pulls together the science story as they believe it reflects the assessment for that compound being evaluated. But then it obviously is subjected to additional reviews by external parties, including the science advisory panels, as well as the external public, such as members of the chemical industry or other individuals interested or parties interested in that science. And then in the end, it does come down to an issue of judgment, although that judgment can be guided by, as I mentioned, there's been extensive investment by the federal government to define what constitutes a high-quality study. So we have a whole set of testing guidelines so that when we do toxicity tests in animals, that they're done according to an accepted protocol that the scientific community universally agrees is sensitive and adequate to evaluate that particular endpoint of concern. And then likewise, we have an additional wide set of guidelines called good laboratory practices to make sure that as those studies are conducted, we're keeping accurate records, and that if the additional other people interested in that science want to actually see the science record of that study, it will be available for them to scrutinize. That is one of the major problems that I certainly highlighted with the example of TCE, where we have an example of the study that was driving the overall risk assessment for TCE was based upon a study where the scientific records, the raw data, was not even available. The author admitted it was fundamentally lost. So it could not be reobtained for reanalysis. But yet the other two studies, conducted of much higher quality studies, there was a full study report conducted according to good laboratory practice, according to EPA guidelines, that was available for complete detailed review by the scientific community. And it's those kinds of judgments that are really used to help differentiate what constitutes a high-quality study versus one of lesser quality studies. And in the end, it is a balancing act for sure, and it also has to deal with, well, how do the higher quality studies perform relative to the lower quality studies. So if you have a consistent pattern of high quality study performance indicating one type of response, but you have an outlier study where you're of uncertain quality that gives you a totally different response, that certainly weighs in terms of your ultimate decision as to how you would look at that science. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, gentlemen's time has expired. Without objection, a letter from Denka Performance Elastomer to Administrator Pruitt requesting that EPA withdraw and correct its IRIS review for chloroprene is entered into the record. Now I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Marshall.
Yeah, good morning. I'm a physician and a biochemist, so this is actually a pretty exciting topic to me. It feels like I'm back in college again. I think my first question is for Dr. Mundt. Chloroprene is neoprene, and that's one of your expertises, I think, that you've been researching. I mean, obviously, bathing your hands in these hydrocarbons is a little bit different than the different phases that they're in. So I'm just very curious from a scientific standpoint, how does IRIS or EPA deal with just whether the chloroprene is liquid, solid, vapor, and do they extrapolate the carcinogenic based upon perhaps the liquid phase compared to the synthetic like our life jackets, I assume, are made out of neoprene, it looks like.
Thank you. I'm not an expert on the chemistry here, but I understand that chloroprene is the monomer or the building block of neoprene. Like vinyl chloride monomer makes polyvinyl chloride. The end product is a stable, very different product. The only epidemiological studies that looked at, reliably looked at worker exposure were those done or overseen by Gary Marsh, Dr. Marsh from the University of Pittsburgh. Most of those studies were in the US, one was in Ireland, and they had quantitative exposure estimates of workers to chloroprene from the largest plant in Louisville. There's the basis for what kinds of exposures humans can be exposed to. These are significantly higher than what might be anywhere outside of a plant. These are workers, and probably the only people exposed to levels.
But they're not extrapolating the liquid product carcinogenic potential as opposed to the way the consumers are using it.
Well, consumers are typically not exposed to this material. In the workplace, though, the workers were exposed to the vapor, so it's in air, and the risks are evaluated based on inhalation exposure.
Okay. Next question for Dr. Buss. If the EPA, if the EPA wants to revise or correct an IRIS assessment, does that ever happen, or how does the process work?
Once a IRIS decision is closed, it can be reevaluated, obviously, because science changes with time. So the presumption would be that is if a new piece of science came into the record that significantly impacted an existing IRIS review, that there should be a process available for reopening that IRIS record so that it could be reevaluated in the context of that new science. The one thing we certainly do know is the IRIS program reviews are not subject, although they're subject to reviews by science advisory panels, they're not subject to any legal review in the courtrooms, at least as I understand it.
But practically speaking, does that happen? Does the EPA ever go back and look at them and make modifications to IRIS findings?
With some of its older compounds, yes, they do come back as new science comes onto the table. My understanding is they have revisited some of their evaluations, but it is a very challenging process in terms of getting it to be reopened, to be reevaluated.
Okay. Last question about formaldehyde. I guess I'll go back to Dr. Mundt. There were some concerns about transparency in years past when the IRIS reviewed formaldehyde. Has the EPA improved in your estimation of that transparency process, or what steps else need to be taken to help it be more transparent?
I would say my interactions with EPA in the last couple of years regarding formaldehyde have been very professional, very cordial. There has been, we've made a great effort to point out to IRIS all of the new science in the last 6 or 7 years that has been published and is relevant to their evaluation. We have asked, however, in response for IRIS to identify what body of scientific papers are they relying on for the revised formaldehyde assessment, and that information has not been shared with us.
So they're not being transparent at this point?
I would say I can't say that there is any source that I can go to say what is EPA considering today, including some of the most recent science that contradicts some of the older science.
Did they give you any explanation why they won't make it be more transparent, or what's going on?
Not specifically. I'm assured that there are many changes underway, but I was also told by Dr. Bahadori, now heading the IRIS program, that many of these changes will not have been implemented in time for the formaldehyde reissue or the finalization of formaldehyde.
Okay, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Christ.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for our panelists for being here today. I'm from Florida, as the chairman noted, which means that obviously with the hurricanes that we've experienced in Texas and one that appears to be bearing down on my home state, these issues are in the forefront of my mind. And so, Dr. Burke, it leads me to a question for you. Can you explain to me and the committee how IRIS risk assessments assist in disaster recovery and response, particularly related to hurricanes and flooding?
Sure. And I've been there as a state official on the front lines. I've worked as a federal official with the environmental leadership of all of the 50 states. And the IRIS program is there. we're talking about the documents that those folks prepare today, but I think what we're not talking about is the scientific expertise at the IRIS program, the folks that are there when Corpus Christi, Texas has a question about an inadvertent chemical contamination of their water supply and has to understand what the exposures might be and what the risks might be. They're there when there's a complicated mixture from a release. They're there to provide, in the case of Harvey, Region 6, our Dallas office, or EPA's Dallas office, excuse me, I don't speak for EPA, but Region 6, with the expertise to understand how to take the samples, to understand the vulnerable populations, and to use the expertise of the IRIS program to really have a strong public health response to environmental disasters that are related to things like extreme weather.
Would emergency responders be able to quickly and safely address the types of chemical spills that we're seeing in the wake of Hurricane Harvey without these risk assessments?
Well, there are many ways that emergency responders need to get information, first of which is understanding what's on site and whether that's reported and shared with the local communities, and that is not part of the IRIS program. But once things are known, IRIS is a reliable and important database that doesn't just look at cancer and rats and things like that, but also looks at the acute exposure risks, the lethal dose, the short-term doses, the neurological effects, the respiratory effects, the irritant effects that we've heard about recently in Texas. And so, yes, IRIS is there. It's a backstop for the states. It's an important tool.
So it's safe to say that timely chemical assessments are pretty important in helping communities and families recover from the unthinkable?
They're essential. They're absolutely essential.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. As you know, the Trump administration has proposed to eliminate the IRIS program, among other important science programs, as well as significantly cut staff at the EPA. Will the EPA be able to handle the recovery and response efforts after Hurricane Harvey and now after Hurricane Irma with a reduced staff? And how would the elimination or downsizing of the IRIS program affect the long-term recovery of communities affected by storms and flooding?
Well, it will have a profound effect on our national capacity to respond to chemical exposures and understanding those risks and the unique combinations. For instance, I worked on the toxic combinations of water in what was called the toxic gumbo of Katrina. These are challenging risk assessments that need to be supported by data and good exposure science. And this is the kind of expertise that you have uniquely in IRIS that goes well beyond just the toxic substances program or looking at industrial chemicals. It really supports every aspect of our public health efforts, and it's really important to the state and local officials to have this resource, to have that number to call, to have those programs of the Office of Research and Development and IRIS there to support them.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Well, thank you very much, and let me just note that we hear charges all the time from people who claim that we are politicizing science by basically supporting positions that are not acceptable to other people who believe that their positions are sacrosanct, I guess, and should not be questioned. As a young man, I remember very well the whole issue of cyclamates. You fellows remember cyclamates? That was the industry, the soda pop industry had put enormous amounts of money into developing a new sweetener, and it was cyclamates, and they got it into the drinks. Then all of a sudden it was said that cyclamates caused cancer, and they had to pull this out. It cost the equivalent of billions of dollars today when this whole thing, by the time it was finished. And then, of course, cyclamates were pulled out, and then 10 years later, after a study, it was found out that cyclamates did not cause the cancer. And the Canadians had never banned the use of cyclamates during that whole time. So we have to be very careful, because those billions of dollars that were wasted in that particular instance could have been used for something else that was beneficial to us. For example, when the cyclamates were pulled out, I know that what came in was high fructose corn syrup instead, which may not cause cancer, but my wife will not let me have anything that has high fructose corn syrup in it. Now, whether or not that means because she's afraid I'm getting fat or whatever it is, the bottom line is the cyclamates would have been more healthy for me than the high fructose corn syrup. So there is harm done by chemicals, and there's no doubt about that. And we should, and I'm very proud that Ronald Reagan signed this bill. I was working for Ronald Reagan at the time. I may have had something to do with the statement made on this issue years ago. But the harm done by cyclamates, or by chemicals and drugs, we also have to recognize there is a danger to be done by not permitting people to use beneficial chemicals and drugs that have had positive impacts on our lives. And so we have to really be serious about it. And I would hope that the IRIS program is being serious about it and does not succumb to what we have seen here over and over again is a politicalization of science. And it's not a politicalization that comes from, oh, we have to represent some major financial interest, but instead it's a politicalization where once in academe that something, and PhDs, I don't know why they have this inclination, but they've spent their life promoting a particular theory, or they've come out and gotten grants on a particular theory, and they will fight to the death to defend that theory, even as more people come up and say, well, that actually it doesn't fit with what we've newly discovered. And I believe that man-made global warming, the fight in that, people have been denied over and over again. We have seen this for over the years, denied research grants by those who claim to be so open-minded and liberal about this, and they've been denied people if they have any question as to whether or not mankind is causing global warming. So one question, I know we're running out of time here for my question, but we need to make sure that people are looking not just at the specific reaction to chemicals, but also what is the threshold that someone, because we all ingest chemicals, even natural chemicals all the time. Threshold is very important, as well as the frequency of exposure. And are we being cautious enough to making sure that we do not take away the beneficial chemical results and chemical things that chemicals can do for us? Is that issue now being handled correctly by this program, or is this still a problem? And I just, for the whole panel. Yes, sir.
Thank you for that excellent question. And in fact, it really touches on the issue that Dr. Burke just touched on. The agency is called on many occasions to deal with some very challenging issues, such as events associated with hurricanes. That means that the staff that they have needs to be put in the right place at the right time, and they certainly cannot be diverted to efforts that ultimately are really not proving, as you say, necessary to improving public health. Let me give you a practical example of that. There's a compound that's under review right now by the agency called ethylbenzene. This is an intermediate compound, 99% of which, in terms of its total chemical production, is used as a closed system intermediate for the production of styrene. So it's a closed process. You're not going to have much releases to the environment as the result of that use. The other exposures to ethylbenzene come from its natural component of gasoline, which of course is assessed by other means independent of the ethylbenzene that's contained within it. It's also another very small component of mixed xylenes, which is a commonly used solvents. But again, mixed xylenes are assessed for their own toxic independently. So why is this important? Well, EPA is set off in terms of projecting, and this is as of just a couple of weeks ago, the IRIS program notified that they were going to continue forward with the evaluation of ethylbenzene in terms of developing an IRIS evaluation of it. That's an extensive effort on their part, which will consume staff time. But yet, over a year ago, in a public problem formulation session, which was appropriately held for this compound, they were advised that this compound is a chemical intermediate, all used in closed system production, and that its exposures, which have been monitored in the air across North America for many years, are less than 1 part per billion, which is the general air concentration associated with ethylbenzene. But here's the kicker. In the case of ethylbenzene, in terms of the animal toxicity studies, the primary endpoint of concern is liver tumors in rats that are seen with ethylbenzene, but they occur only at a concentration of 750,000 parts per billion. Now, I would argue when you look at that data set alone, you would say that particular compound might not be worthy of where a significant resource investment by the agency justifies evaluation of a compound for that concern. And that frees the agency up to make the types of information flow that's necessary for the other critical events that they're challenged with dealing with on an everyday basis, as Dr. Burke has already mentioned. So it's just one example that's actually currently in progress today. So it's, again, another example of has the IRIS program truly learned and put into action what its words are versus where it's walking the talk. At least from my perspective, I have some real concerns that that isn't the case. And in the end result of it is just as you've just described. The necessary resources of the agency to truly protect public health, which I believe is exactly what they should be doing, are constrained when they're not making wise decisions as to where best to put their time in terms of evaluating the science.
Thank you, and the gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Burke, you said you spent some time in Houston. What part?
Actually, I was part of the downtown. I lived at the Texas Medical Center in student housing while I was pursuing my degree there, and part of the flood of '76.
Oh, I got you. Well, don't tell us how old you are now.
I'm pretty old.
You said in your written remarks, the capacity to evaluate chemicals is essential to public health, end quote. Dr. Mundt, you wouldn't disagree with that, would you?
No, sir.
Dr. Buss, you wouldn't disagree with that, would you?
Absolutely have to do that.
Yeah. So I'm going to start back at the other end of the table. Dr. Mundt, have you ever known scientists to be wrong?
Quite frequently.
Quite frequently. Dr. Buss, how about you?
I would agree, but there are certainly processes now available to help resolve those disagreements among scientists. So, for instance, I mentioned mode of action frameworks, an excellent way to resolve those types of debates.
I just want to make the point that scientists, well, let me get Dr. Burke in here first. You ever known scientists to be wrong?
I sure have.
Okay, so they're not infallible. One of the problems that I see with the way the program is that the IRIS assessment is not reviewable by courts. Are you aware of that, Dr. Mundt?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Dr. Buss?
Yes.
Dr. Berg?
I'll
Let's
I think that the regulatory application of IRIS is certainly consistently reviewed by the court.
Well, let me say it this way then. If that were in fact the case, the process is not reviewable by courts, would that be problematic, Dr. Mundt?
I have.
I mean, if it's not reviewable by courts, do you see that as a problem?
I was going to say only if it's wrong.
Yeah.
If it's right,
well,
then of course we embrace
it. Would be
it.
great, but that the
If
court
it's wrong,
system.
where can you then turn?
I got you, Dr. Buss. If it's not reviewable by courts, is that problematic?
It can be in certain circumstances, yes.
Dr. Burke?
Again, I think the regulatory application is what the focus should be on, and my understanding is that is reviewable by courts and very often reviewed.
Let me read something that I have here. A March 2008 GOA report noted that EPA has not been able to, quote, routinely complete credible IRIS assessments, end quote. More recently, a 2011 NAS report found that EPA's IRIS claims were not supported by its assessments, they were subjective, and that no clear scientific framework had been used by EPA to reach its conclusions. The NAS also stated that the IRIS program was deficient in meeting the benchmarks of objectivity, scientific accuracy, and transparency necessary to ensure high quality and reliable assessments. Any of y'all familiar with that report? Simple question. Dr. Mundt?
Yes.
Dr.
it's
Buss?
reflecting formaldehyde.
Dr. Burke?
I assume that's from the
Okay.
2011.
So does that sound problematic to you, Dr. Mundt?
I've spent the last 5, 6 years working on that issue with regard to formaldehyde.
To you, Dr. Buss, is that problematic?
Very much so.
Dr. Burke?
Yes, and
Okay, thank you for that. Let me go to my fifth question. Dr. Burke, you said that you had personally, I think, closed down some water plants in New Jersey?
yes, sir.
Is that right? Well, you need to come back to Texas. You also said that you felt like that the IRIS was critical in emergencies like hurricanes where they could be out there on the ground taking samples. Is that a fair recounting of what you said?
I think it's, yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the TCEQ in Texas, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality?
Yes, I am.
Are you aware that it is the second largest regulatory agency in the world, second only to the federal EPA?
I wasn't aware of that, but I am familiar with it.
Right. Well, I can tell you, having served in the Texas legislature for 2 terms, 4 years, I was on the Environmental Reg Committee, I can tell you that's a fact. Do you think the TCEQ would have a vested interest in having boots on the ground immediately in those areas and assessing those same kinds of situations?
Yeah, I think the state responsibilities are essential, and they have that role.
Okay. Well, I appreciate y'all being here today. I think the statements, the evidence, and the hearing kind of speaks for itself. Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the members of the panel for being here. Dr. Burke, you mentioned that the member of the National Academy of Sciences, you've made recommendations for IRIS for some reforms. Did I get that right?
Yes,
Okay.
a 2009 report.
Have they followed through with those reforms that you've recommended?
They are moving forward yes, in a very responsive way, but the reforms are challenging. There are inherent uncertainties in the science and very often a lack of scientific information that make it challenging, but I'm very satisfied and have been part of pushing them to do just that.
So those recommendations are 2009, 2017. They still haven't implemented. How much are you projecting how long it's going to take?
I can't speak for how the program is going now, but I know that it was a focus of my efforts to improve that program, and they have implemented tremendous improvement.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mundt, in 2017, the GAO in their high-risk report set out numerous recommendations for IRIS. Others have as well. To your knowledge, has EPA established timelines for the different stages of the assessment process since the GAO report?
I've not seen any.
Okay. Dr. Buss, do you know?
No.
Okay. I wouldn't expect if in 2009 they haven't made significant progress in the other recommendations they've done anything. Dr. Buss, the 2017 GAO report also indicates that excuse me, other EPA offices do not exclusively use IRIS assessments for information on toxicity. The use of alternative sources for toxicity information begs the question, are there in fact other sources better equipped to provide information IRIS assessments do not? And are these sources able to make up for our shortfalls? So it appears that EPA doesn't even use its own data. Are you aware of that?
Most of the science that the EPA considers in terms of its chemical evaluations is science coming from other sources. They do have their own Office of Research and Development, but the vast majority of the science that they ultimately end up incorporating into their assessment comes from either industry sources or from primarily the academic environment. So those are the primary sources of the science that they use.
I guess what is IRIS used for if EPA typically doesn't use it?
the primary purpose of IRIS is to pull together their IRIS evaluations, the objective of which is to develop what they call reference concentrations. So these are concentrations which they believe the public can be exposed, the science says the public can be exposed to without reasonable concern for harm. And likewise, they also do cancer evaluations to say at what level of exposure is it acceptable where you might not be vulnerable to having cancer as a consequence of exposure to this agent. And that's where the debate often comes in with respect to IRIS evaluation, because there, the studies that you use as the basis for making those determinations for those key values, the reference concentrations and the reference doses and the cancer values, are really what drive the regulatory action. So by way of example, Dr. Burke mentioned one of the things that an emergency provider immediately would ask in the case of a chemical release associated with a hurricane, by way of example, is there a reference concentrate, an acute reference concentration associated with this material? So if people happen to be exposed to the vapors, or a first responder is exposed to the vapors, what do we know about the potential for that to cause that harm? So having that value is useful if you can measure it at the same time. Now, it's also fair to say that the agency is not the only agency, and here's another issue regarding redundancy. The National Academy of Sciences has an extensive battery of what they call acute emergency guidelines. They have an entire committee devoted to saying, in these acute circumstances, like chemical releases associated with these natural disasters, the first responders can consult the EGLE values and to say, what can we expect, as a consequence of exposure to the first responders and then ultimately to the surrounding population as well. So not having the IRIS there for those acute responses is certainly covered by other areas in the risk assessment community. So, for instance, the National Academy of Sciences and their EGLE values.
Okay. Dr. Mundt, is IRIS in need of major reforms, or is it duplicative now that we have other resources like Dr. Buss has brought up?
Well, the range of products IRIS produces is broad. It not only includes the reference concentrations, but it's one of the main organizations, the other being the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, the National Toxicology Program, for classifying substances as carcinogenic. So there's another area where there's some redundancy. I think one or the other could do this, but in every case, it ought to be done well with high-quality science. So I don't think that all of the functions of IRIS currently could be absorbed by other organizations.
But we do agree that need of major reform.
It's clear that there are major reforms underway because the problems have been recognized. Whether and at what rate they'll be implemented is yet to be seen.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Tucano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Burke, good morning.
Good morning.
Despite the vital function IRIS provides in assessing the public health dangers of chemicals, and recent findings by both GAO and the academies that EPA has made progress in improving the IRIS process, this administration proposed to eliminate the program altogether. My first question is, why would that matter? As a former state environmental official and former EPA science advisor, you bring a unique perspective to the table regarding the usefulness of IRIS. How does the program help state and local officials, public health professionals, and the public? But first, answer the question, why would it matter?
Well, it matters tremendously to the frontline people in public health and environmental protection that we have a consistent source of information. I remember the chaos before 1983 when the risk assessment process got started, in 85 when IRIS was established. And we risk returning to 50 different solutions, as strong as some states may be. I think the business community does not want 50 different solutions, 50 different numbers, and certainly the health effects aren't different in the states. And so it would be a chaotic situation if that program were no longer there to respond to the nation's environmental chemical priorities.
Well, what impact would eliminating IRIS have on EPA's statutory obligations?
Well, the National Center for Environmental Assessment and the IRIS program really are the starting point for the science. EPA is only as strong as the science that supports its decisions. And EPA has very clear statutory authorities for clean air and clean water and the cleanup of hazardous waste. Each one of these is guided by science, whether it's for a cleanup value or a contaminant level for drinking water or an air quality standard. Without IRIS, without the scientific engines that support that mandate, I feel that EPA would fail to meet its public health responsibilities.
Well, based on these impacts, does it make sense to reduce overall staff or monetary resources for the IRIS program?
Again, I think it's an essential capacity for not just EPA but the nation. Reducing that staff is very short-sighted and I think would have profound effects not just on public health but on our business community as well.
So it doesn't make sense at all to reduce the staff. Dr. Burke, as you state in your testimony, the scientific peer review process is essential to producing credible results, addressing uncertainties, and explaining the scientific basis for conclusions. And contrary to what some of my Republican colleagues believe, the peer review process is a critical part of how we conduct science in this country and around the world. Could you expand on your testimony and describe for us exactly why the peer review process is built into IRIS and why it is so essential?
Sure. Independent peer review is essential. All of the data, that as was said by my colleagues here, that EPA uses is from the academic community, the scientific community, the industry community, and is peer reviewed prior to being part of this synthesis of information. But IRIS documents are subject to the highest levels of peer review, first through committees of the EPA Science Advisory Board, and very often for the high-profile, high-impact compounds or substances, the National Academy of Sciences, our highest level of scientific expertise in this country. And so it is essential to be independent. It is essential that it is be reviewed with the kind of scrutiny and the kind of updating that were suggested here today. But I have to mention one very important distinction between stakeholder input and independent scientific peer review. These are very different things. And sometimes we get confused about having stakeholders express their opinions on things, on the costs of regulation and things like that. That is important, but very different than the independence of the scientific review. And I fear that we may have gotten these things kind of crossed. And what you see is a frustration on the part of stakeholders because they don't like the answer. Because in my experience in 40 years, I have never seen a stakeholder industry come forward with their risk assessment and say, EPA, you got it wrong. Your number is way too high. This is bad stuff. It's always recommending a more lenient approach with the public's health.
Thank you, Dr. Burke.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses as well. Dr. Buss, do IRIS assessments properly consider real-world regulatory and risk management implications of its hazard assessments?
The risk management applications, if I understand it, is actually outside the domain of the IRIS program. Their intention is and their objective and their responsibility is to assess the science that ultimately then is translated for use by the risk managers. However, if that science is not pulled together in a way that represents the best reflection of the practice of that science, it will result in poor risk management decisions. Yeah. So by way of example, I mentioned the trichloroethylene example. I'll come back to that. The risk managers now are faced with the potential option of saying, do we need to revisit all of the Superfund sites that had been resolved for trichloroethylene? Do they need to be reopened now as a result of this reassessment conducted by the IRIS program? That's how it flows into a risk management decision.
Okay, thank you very much. And then, Dr. Mundt, does IRIS use a weight of evidence framework that incorporates all relevant and reliable data?
This is one of the key criticisms that the earlier NAS committees identified, and I understand there's efforts in place to move toward this. But in the two chemistries that I've been involved with for the last few years, it's clear that that was not the case. The especially epidemiological human health studies, were all considered as equals, where there were some that were considerably stronger and others that were considerably weaker. Preferentially, we tend to favor the results from studies that are well conducted, well documented, large numbers, strong exposure assessments, and whatever they say should drive the assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. One more question, Dr. Buss, if you don't mind, what steps in the current IRIS process are most troublesome to you? You've mentioned some already, but with chemical toxicity, does one process fit all, or should it be tailored based on the type of chemical and the need for speedy assessment?
You've put your finger on certainly several of the key issues. The ability to identify which compounds really need the attention of the agency to the degree of investment that they engage in with an IRIS evaluation certainly is important. The other arena in which the IRIS program has struggled with mightily without coming to any effective resolution, even as of the last several reviews that have just been released over this summer, and that is how to use mode of action science. And why is that important? The vast majority of the decisions that are made with respect to evaluating the health effects of chemicals arises from data flowing from animal toxicology studies, because we simply don't have often, I'm sure my colleague Dr. Mundt would agree, the horsepower in epidemiology necessarily to tease out those health effects with an epidemiological. So we rely on animal studies. But we also know animals are not little people, and that in some cases they don't behave the same way biologically as do adults. And we can also, because we can put these animals in cages and give them any amount of chemical that we choose, we often use doses that are far disparate from real-world exposures. And now we recognize that doing that kind of science often can generate results that are fundamentally not quantitatively relevant to human risk. So the IRIS program has, I'll have to admit, over its entire existence, struggled mightily with the use of mode of action data, and I don't believe you can hardly point to a single example where mode of action science, despite the extensive investment in the scientific community to pay for and generate that science, where it's ever been effectively used.
I understand. Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentleman yields. And now I thank the witnesses for your testimony. It's very valuable, very insightful, very interesting today. And the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned.